Okie dokie, here we go. All right, just gonna wait a couple seconds here to make sure anyone who wants to come check out the stream is here, and then we'll kind of talk a little bit about what we're actually doing. So one thing that I really meant to do that I didn't do is update the title of the stream. So I don't know if I can change that on the fly, but let's go ahead and see if we can do it here. Basic info. So we'll change this to building a sortable component with Vue.js. And do I have to do anything to save that? Saved. Cool. So I wonder if I refresh the actual stream if that's updated. Yeah, it is. Cool. Perfect. Okay. All right. So why don't we just get into it? So sortable stuff and drag and drop stuff is like a pretty common thing that I've needed to implement on different applications and stuff that I've worked on over the years. And not too long ago, I think sometime last year, Shopify put out this new draggable library that looked like it was really well done, and I hadn't had a chance to use it. So I thought what would be fun to try and do is turn this into like a Vue component that we could interact with in a very sort of component driven way. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means as we go through it. But here's kind of the landing page for this Shopify thing. You can just kind of drag stuff around and, do all sorts of weird stuff. It's pretty cool. So I put together a little demo that shows sort of how it works in general. So why don't we take a quick peek at this? So the way it works is you can go and click like these drag handles over here, and we can like sort these items. This is like a make-believe sort of to-do list app, right? So if we go and take a look at the code for this, I just have it all as one like static HTML page, so we can see what it looks like to build this using the Draggable library without any Vue stuff at all, just sort of using it exactly as the docs sort of explain out of the box. So we've got a bunch of HTML here. The most important part is this unordered list. And inside that is a bunch of hard-coded list items, and each list item is like a to-do, right? So down at the bottom here, you can see we're pulling in this draggable library just over our CDN, and then we initialize it to sort of make it kind of work and kind of turn it on. So the way that it works is you call this sortable constructor passing through a reference to sort of like the container element that you want to turn into a sortable list. So in this case, I'm just passing through all of the unordered lists on the page. We only have one, so it's just going to affect this one. And then you have a couple options here. So draggable, this is the child selector inside of this item that you want to actually be draggable, right? So that's the thing that should move around, the things that should be sortable relative to each other. So in this case, we have every single list item as being draggable or sortable. And then you have this other option for specifying what you want the drag handle to be. So what you can click to actually do the sorting. In this case, I'm just saying the SVG element inside each list item is our drag handle. So this isn't how I would actually do this in real life, right? Like you would use classes probably or data attributes or something to target this. So it's a little less specific, but for the purposes of just sort of showing how to turn this stuff on and make it work, I think this is fine. So you can see this whole thing is an unordered list. Each one of these is a list item, and these drag handles are our SVG. And we can sort of drag this stuff around. If you want the whole list item to be draggable, you can just not use a handle at all. And now you can click and drag the entire thing, which is kind of cool too. So this is neat in terms of like, it works looking at it, right? The interface works, things move around and stuff like that. But if you're going to try and incorporate this into a Vue.js application, we'd have a little bit of a problem in terms of trying to keep track of how this is affecting our data, right? Like the way that Vue works in libraries like React and stuff too, is they're all sort of like data-driven interfaces. So typically, you wouldn't have a bunch of hard-coded list items in the Vue that you're sort of making sortable. These to be generated in like a v-for loop from some data source, and we would want it such that when you go and do some dragging like this, we want the data source to be updated to reflect that new order. So what I want to work on is trying to wrap up this Shopify library as a Vue component, but trying to do it in a way that makes it really, really flexible and really easy to customize how things look, and very reusable and declarative. So why don't we take a look at another project I have here. Well, it's the same project, but another piece of it. So this is just a basic Vue CLI app using the latest beta of Vue CLI 3. And here we have like our main app component. And I've kind of copied over the basic structure of what we had here into this component here. So we have an unordered list, and then we have a bunch of list items, but this time, instead of them being hard-coded, they're data-driven, so they're coming from this data property in our component. So we have a list of to-dos, and each to-do has an ID so that we can key them reliably. It has a description, and then we track whether or not they're complete. So I'm iterating over all those to-dos and rendering an LI for each one. And we still have the drag handle and all that stuff, right? So if we go ahead and look over here, you can see I have the same thing, but now like none of the drag and drop stuff works or anything because we haven't actually pulled in this Shopify library or tried to make it work at all. So let's think about how we want this to even work. So the way that I want to approach this is I want to try and build like, I wrote a blog post a couple weeks ago on renderless Vue components, right? Where you're creating these components that just sort of try to encapsulate behavior and interaction, but let you provide all of the template and interface so that it's very reusable and easy to customize. So I'd like to build a sortable component that is sort of built using this Shopify library, but that lets us work with sortable stuff in a way that we can just basically make anything sortable whenever we want in sort of a componentized, template-driven way. So the way that the Shopify library works, right, is you do a bunch of stuff in JavaScript to enable things and get things working. The most kind of recommended approach to code reuse in Vue is through components. So what I want to do is figure out a way to turn these options and the way this works into a set of components that we could combine to wrap things up and make things sortable. So to get started, why don't we talk a little bit about the three pieces that are kind of involved here. As far as I can tell, there's sort of like three components we're going to need to make. So there's the container, right? The thing that holds all the sortable items, which in our case is the UL, and that's the element that you pass in to the sortable constructor. So we have this like sortable list or sortable container component. We also have the items that are meant to be sortable. So each list item here is meant to be draggable, right? Or sortable. We're using sortable, which is sort of a layer on top of Shopify's base draggable stuff. But that sounds like maybe that's a component too, this idea of like a sortable item. And then we also have the handle for trying to control what you click to make something sortable. So I think we have three components here. I think we have a sortable list or a sortable container, a sortable item, and then like a sortable handle. So why don't we just kind of take a look at what we have here and think about what it might look like to try and make this sortable using components, and not necessarily focus on getting it to work right away, but just thinking about like how would it look like to use? What would like the API of these components look like? So if we have something like a sortable list component, right? We have to somehow provide the template for this. Like, what does the sortable container look like? What is the sortable container? In our case, we want it to be these ULs, right? So the way that I think that this should work is sortable list can be a renderless component. So it's a component that doesn't actually render any of its own HTML. It only renders a slot or a scoped slot. And we pass in the HTML and it'll kind of wrap that up. So I kind of think the way this should work is we should have this sortable list component and we just pass in this UL as like a slot. And now we're kind of marking this UL as being a sortable list. This ends up being like a parameter to the sortable list. But we also need a way to basically control which items in this are the sortable items as well as what the handles are. So I think we can sort of approach that in a similar way by adding some child components here to sort of wrap things up and mark which things are sortable items. So if we were taking the same approach we were taking to this whole list, well, if we want each one of these LIs to be sortable items, the most like component-driven way I can think of to do that is just to create a new component called like a sortable item and wrap each LI in that sortable item. Right, so now we have this sortable list, and here's kind of the root element for the sortable list. And then we have a bunch of sortable items. Now, the thing that we're going to have to do differently here is we don't want to iterate over these to-dos on the LI. We're going to want to repeat the sortable items, but we can talk about that as we go. So now we're going to have a bunch of these sortable items, right? Now, each sortable item has this handle, which is this SVG. So we have to have some way to mark this. So again, taking the same sort of approach, I think what we should do here is we should just sort of wrap that up. So we should just say maybe something like sortable handle, and then pass in the SVG into the sortable handle. Okay, so we don't want to iterate over these to-dos here. We probably want to iterate over them on the sortable item itself because we want to repeat this, right? So now, of course, this isn't going to actually work because we haven't actually done anything to make it work. So why don't we start by just trying to create some of these components and thinking a little bit about how they're going to work. So I'm going to make a new file in the components directory here called sortable list.vue. And we're going to want to register that down here. So components is going to need to have sortable list. And we're going to want to import sortable list from components, sortable list. Okay. So we have this sortable list component. Let's think about like how it's going to actually work. It's going to be a render list component, so it's not going to have any of its own template. So we can just sort of remove this. And because of that, we could just make this a JavaScript file if we wanted to, but I'm fine with just keeping it as a Vue file. We're probably going to have some props, but let's not worry about that right now. Data, I don't think we're actually going to need any data, but we'll see. Methods, I don't think we're going to need methods either. But we're going to need a render function, right, to tell it what it is supposed to render. So in this case, we're passing through a slot, and this is all we want to render. We just want to render the contents of this thing. So we can get access to that slot by just saying this.slots.default, and that'll give us kind of this default slot here. This actually returns an array. So since we only have one item here, we're going to want to get item 0. So why don't we just save this, head over here. I'm going to move this looping back to the LI for now, just temporarily. And let's comment out some of these components that we're not using yet, and just kind of see if this whole thing is actually going to render or work. So let me just make sure that everything's building. So if we head over here now and refresh this, it looks like it's still rendering. And if we head over to the View tab, we can see we've got an app component with a sortable list. Okay, so the sortable list component is rendering. It's just not doing anything yet. So maybe this would be a good time to at least try and get the sortable behavior working visually, even if it's not actually like data driven and working the way that we ultimately want it to work yet. Let's just see if we can sort of use this component as a wrapper to drive out the Shopify stuff so that we can make something sortable without having to reference Shopify here. You know what I mean? It's sort of encapsulated in this sortable list. So I don't think I've pulled in that dependency yet. So why don't we go ahead and add that? We'll stop building for a sec and we'll add Shopify Draggable. And wait a second or two for that to pull in. Okay, so we got that. Let's go ahead and serve this up again. Okay, so this is still going. Let's back to the code here. Now inside this sortable list component, this is where we want to do the stuff to actually, make the Shopify thing work. So why don't we start by importing that library so we have a reference to it here. So we can get sortable. I think we have to destructure it out of their export here. So import that from Shopify Draggable, and just to see that we're not crazy, let's just log that and make sure that we're getting something here. So we do get that class, so that's working. Okay, so looking back at our original example, we're going to basically need to do, instead of draggable.sortable, just sortable, because we've sort of pulled that in on its own. So let's just copy this code and figure out where we're going to put it in the sortable list to kind of make things work. So the way that you would typically do this is because this needs to work with elements that are actually in the DOM, we have to do it in the mounted lifecycle hook. That's where we're going to create this list. So instead of doing draggable.sortable, we just want to do sortable. Now we don't want to do document.querySelector_all because we don't want to specify that we're looking for ULs or anything like that, right? What we're actually trying to do here is we want to use the element that's coming from the slot. So we can get access to the root element of a component using this.$L. So if we do this.$L here, we're passing in a direct reference to the DOM node that is the root of this component. Draggable li, we can leave this for now. We're going to want to change this, but let's just leave it for now and see if we can get things kind of working. And the handle, we'll just leave that hard-coded to the SVG too. So it looks like things are still building. Sometimes with these sorts of components where you're doing things in like mounted hooks, hot reloading doesn't work totally perfectly, so you do have to do like a refresh. But if we look now, it looks like we are able to sort things, right? So that's kind of neat. But we have a little bit of a problem, which is that if you look at app and we look at the to-dos, and we kind of open these up, you can see get travel insurance is still first, even though pay hydro bill is now first. So even though we're able to sort this, we're not reporting these changes back to our app so that we can actually update our state, which means if we were to ever do something that triggered a re-render here, these would be re-rendered in the wrong order, which is not something that we want. So why don't we start by trying to get that reactivity and that sort of communication between the components working, even though we kind of have this kind of hard-coded junk in here. And then after we have that kind of working, let's move towards trying to make it so we don't have to rely on this hard-coded LI and SVG stuff, and instead we can use the Sortable Item and Sortable Handle sort of markers to get things working. Okay, so let's think about how this is going to have to work. If we want to be able to report back to the app some changes in the sort order, that means that this component is going to sort of need to have a reference to that data. Right now it doesn't have a reference to that data. We're just passing in these items from the parent in the slot, which means the sortable list doesn't actually have a reference to the items that it's trying to keep track of, like the sort order for and stuff. So I think what we should do, in a perfect world anyways, we want this sortable list to kind of work like an input in Vue, right? Where you can do something like input, and you can say like VModel is, email or whatever, and this will be like two-way bound and sort of update automatically. It'd be cool if sortable list, we could do like VModel equals to-dos, and this will just like automatically synchronize our to-dos with changes here. That's kind of what I want to get working. So to make this work, we're going to want to pass in those to-dos, but then instead of iterating over the to-dos that we have in our current parent scope, we're going to want to iterate over the to-dos that the sortable list holds a reference to. So this is kind of tricky. So if we go over the sortable list, the way the VModel works in Vue, when you're implementing VModel from scratch, all we're really doing is binding a value prop here and listening for an input event and doing something here. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to have a value prop that we specify on the sortable list so that we have a reference to the to-dos that come in. And now, in order to give this slot access to the to-dos that were passed into the sortable list instead of referencing the ones that are in the current scope, what we're going to need to do is make this a scoped slot so that we can actually pass data to it from the child. So that would look something like this. Instead of referencing slots.default, let's get scoped slots.default, and we'll pass in any slot prop information that we want the parent to be able to reference. So I think a good name for the sortable items, like the things that we want to loop over, I don't like value. I don't want to hard code to-dos, but I think just items is a nice generic name that's pretty clear. So why don't we say that the items that we're passing back are the prop that came in, the value prop. And now here, we can change this regular slot to a scoped slot by adding a slot scope attribute and destructuring out the items. So now instead of looping over the to-dos, if we loop over the items that came back, well then in theory, this should work the same way it did before. Okay, so we got no errors or anything. Everything still is kind of working, which is nice. Now we haven't actually done any of the work to fix the sort order. So if you look, the first item is still wrong here. But now that we actually have a reference to these items in the sortable list component, we can actually try and get this actually working. Okay, so in order to update the parent state using a VModel sort of approach like this, we're going to need to fire an input event from the sortable list whenever the sort order changes. So whenever the sort order changes, we want to fire an event to the parent that says, hey, the list order has updated. Here's the new list in the new order. So the way that we do that, if we head over to the Shopify Draggable Documentation and head over to the documentation for Sortable, which is sort of the package that we're using, it has these events that we can listen to. So there's an event for when someone starts sorting. There's an event that fires right before two elements swap positions. There's an event that fires after the elements swap positions. And then there's an event that fires when the user sort of lets go of the mouse and the new sort order has sort of committed. So those four events are like, as soon as I click here, that's going to be that first event. As soon as I drag it over another item and they switch positions, there's an event that fires right before they switch. There's also an event that fires right after they switch. And then there's an event that fires when I let go and everything is sort of committed to the new state. So we probably care about this sortable stop event. So this is the event that fires when everything is done and we have the list in the new order. So in order to listen to that event, all we have to do is add an event listener here to sortable. So we can say .on and then pass the event name, which is sortable:stop. And then we can register a callback here that accepts that event. And here we can just maybe console log the event and sort of see what we're getting. Let's go and refresh this and head over to the console. So in theory, when I drag this and let go of it, we should get an event show up. Okay, so we got a sortable stop event. And if we look at the data, it's saying that the element that was at index 2 is now at index 0. So we sort of have captured the change that happened, and we can use that to update the actual list. So actually doing that update is a tricky little piece of code to kind of put this array in the right order. So I'm going to just kind of snag it from some work that I did earlier. And we can talk a little bit about what it's actually doing. Okay, so here I have this move function that takes an array, takes an old index and a new index, and what it does is it returns the array with whatever was at the old index moved to the new index. So to do this in sort of an immutable way without using splice, which can have side effects that are unpredictable if you're not careful, what we end up doing is we build a new array with the item that changed position removed, right? So say our starting point is an array that looks like A, B, C, D, E, and say we moved D over to here, right? So say that we, let's duplicate this line and say that we moved D over to here. the first step in this sort of little algorithm here is to find the item that moved and just remove it. So what we actually end up with is we have an array that looks like this, with the item completely removed, right? And the way that we do that is we slice from 0 to the old index, right, which is here. So we take this array, and then we merge that with all the items that came after it. So with this, and that's what gives us this. Now what we want to do is we want to drop this D into its new position. So we return a new array that starts with all of the items from 0 up until the new position of D. So in this case, the new position of D is index 1. So we want to grab from 0 to 1, which is only going to be this item. So this is kind of the first chunk of our array. Then we drop in D, which is the item from that old index, right? Its original position from the original list. And then to fill in the rest of the array, we slice this array from the new index, which is where we dropped D, which is position 1, and slice that all the way up to the end. So grabbing all this stuff, and then we just drop, D in between. So we build this new array out of 3 pieces: everything before D, D, and everything after D, and that's going to give us the array in the new order. So kind of just like an interesting little function for moving items in arrays, not really specifically related to what we're doing with Vue here, but it's necessary for us to get this working. Okay, so what we really want to do here is when this event is fired, we want to report back to the parent by emitting an input event that the list order has changed, right? So again, this isn't anything totally magic or anything. It's just the convention for VModel is VModel represents a value prop and an input event. So we could do this manually if we wanted to, and referencing these, but VModel kind of lets you do it in a nice way. So we want to emit an input event with the updated list. And the way that we're going to get the updated list is we're going to call this move function, passing through the original items, and then we're going to pass through the old index and the new index. In this case, it's e.oldIndex, e.newIndex. All right. So let's give this a refresh and see how we're looking here. So I'm going to open these up, and let's just see. Okay, item 1 is get travel insurance. If we drop that down to item 2 and let go, now item 1 is pay hydro bill. Sorry, item 0 is pay hydro bill, and item 2 is get travel insurance. If we move this one up to the very top, it updates. So now we've successfully sort of synced the data between the two. So when someone actually makes changes using this drag and drop stuff, this sortable thing, those changes are actually represented in the data now. So if we want to clean this up a little bit, we can just destructure these out of that event. So we can say old index, new index. Then we don't have to reach in there to grab them. And this should still work. Oh, we got to wrap this with some brackets. Okay. So let's go ahead and just take a quick peek in here and make sure that if I move item 1 down, it gets updated. Okay, so things are working. Pretty wild. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So we've got this thing kind of working, right? But we have this problem where things are sort of hard-coded to rely on LIs and SVGs, which is weak. It'd be nice if we could make this work for any type of elements, right? It shouldn't be like restricted so specifically to this or coupled so tightly to this. So the way that I think we want to make that work is by trying to sort of introduce this stuff, right? Make this stuff work. So why don't we start with these sortable items? So I'm going to uncomment sortable item. Everything's going to break. And I'm going to make a new component. And we'll start by maybe we'll just duplicate the sortable list component as a starting point. And we'll call it sortable item. Now we'll get rid of this move function because we don't need it. We don't need this sortable thing. We don't need any props. The render function will make it empty. And we'll get rid of the mounted callback. Okay, so this is just sort of a bare renderless component for us to work with. Let's head over to app.vue and actually pull this in. So sortable item, sortable item. And let's just see what's going on here. So expected to return a value in render function. Yeah, things are obviously not working yet. Okay, so what we wanted to do is we wanted to take the v4 stuff and move that to the sortable item, right? Not to the li. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create this sort of parent-child relationship where sortable list knows, based on the fact that you've sort of marked things with this component, that these are the things that you want to iterate over, the things that you want to be sortable, sorry. We basically want to remove this dependency of having this hard-coded li thing and instead just have it look for sortable items, essentially. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. So render isn't doing anything. We don't get anything, which is fine. So what we want to do now is we want sortable item to render its default slot. So we can do the same thing that we were doing originally in the sortable list. We don't have any slot scope props that we need to pass through, at least not yet. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, who knows. So for now, let's just start with a regular slot. So we'll say this.slots.default, and we'll sort of make this assumption that people aren't allowed to pass in multiple root nodes, and we'll just pass in this one. Okay, so that gets this working, and if I'm not mistaken, the sorting should still work. Yeah, because the LIs are still there. Okay, so now that that's kind of working, even though the sortable item isn't actually doing anything, we can try and do a little bit of refactoring to remove this dependency on this li element, right? Remove this coupling. So the way that I came up with to do this is with this sortable library, the only way to tell it what things are draggable is with a selector. We have to give it some sort of selector. So we have to say what the element type is, or, you know, what the class is, like sortable item or something like that. That's the only way that it can actually work. But we don't want the consumer to have to know about that, right? So I kind of like this idea of maybe doing something like this, where we're saying we want to look for sortable item as a class, but we don't want to force someone manually to have to say like sortable item here. To me, that's like leaking an implementation detail that just makes this like not useful anymore. It removes the point of this component abstraction. I want someone to basically say, this is a sortable item in a declarative component driven way. I don't want to leak information about the fact that we have to use class selectors to make this work. So I think what I want to do is I want to update this to look for something like sortable item, and we can change this later, or we can make this parameterizable or something like that. But what I want to do is I want to have this sortable item component here. I want this component to be responsible for adding this class to the root node so that the consumer doesn't have to add it themselves. It sort of gets added secretly behind the scenes because it's purely an implementation detail that should be encapsulated inside this set of sortable components. So how can we actually make that work? It's a little bit, it's not tricky, but you have to do like direct DOM manipulation, which is something that people sometimes are uncomfortable with in Vue, but is actually a totally valid way to handle stuff. Like the sort of the point of these components is to encapsulate that stuff a lot of the time and make it so as a consumer, everything feels declarative and you don't really have to worry about it. But I think it's totally reasonable for a component to encapsulate some direct DOM manipulation stuff when necessary. So the way that we can do that in this case is by adding a lifecycle hook to mounted that basically says when this li is added to the DOM, we want to add a class to it, right? In this case, it's this sortable item class. So the way that we can do that is kind of like we did here where we grabbed the root node using this.$L. We can do that here too. We can say this.$L, which is the root node of the item, which is this li. We can say l.classList.add to add a new class, and we just want to add the sortable item class. So right now we have a little bit of coupling. There's always going to be coupling between a sortable list and a sortable item. They're meant to be used together. But we have some duplication in that we're duplicating this string between these two places. That's something that I want to sort out, but we can figure it out later. Let's just get it working for now. So what we're doing here is when this list item is mounted, and it's not necessarily a list item anymore, remember, right? It's whenever the sortable item component is mounted to the DOM, we add this class to it such that it gets caught by this. Okay? It's pretty it's not simple stuff, right? This is like some pretty advanced sort of fancy Vue stuff, but let's just see what happens. Okay, so now sorting is still working. If we go and look at the app, let's make sure that our stuff is still updating. It looks like it is because Design Twitter is at the top, Record Podcast is now at the top, so that stuff's all working. So that's pretty sweet. And we've removed this sort of coupling about these things being list items, right? So for example, now say I wanted to change this UL to be a div. Say we wanted to make this like less semantic for whatever reason. And then instead of these list items being LIs, we just make each to do a div as well. Well, in theory, if we've done this right, we can refresh this and everything still works. So we've removed that coupling of the specific type of elements that are actually necessary to make this work, right? So now anything can be a sortable list and anything can be a sortable item. So that's pretty cool. The next step is the sortable handle. So we have the same sort of situation, right? Sortable handle right now is hard-coded to just be some SVG element. That's obviously not ideal. Sometimes you want the sortable handle to be something else. So let's try and get that working, basically using the same refactoring that we just used. We'll introduce a sortable handle component, and it's going to look more or less just like this. So I'm going to duplicate the sortable item. I'm going to make a sortable handle component. It's going to do the same thing where it just renders its slot, so it doesn't add any of its own HTML. And we just have to figure out what class we want to add. So we're doing .sortable item. Why don't we just kind of naively do .sortable handle? Yes, there's chances of naming collisions and stuff like that. That's another thing that we can talk about going forward, but let's kind of just get it working in a generalized way first. So we'll look for sortable handles, and here in the sortable handle, we'll add sortable handle instead of sortable item. So let's go and pull this in. So we'll duplicate this import. So we'll say sortable handle. And we'll pull that in here too. And now, if I'm not mistaken, I think like we've actually done enough to make that work. So if we drag the sortable handle, everything kind of works. So it doesn't have to be an SVG anymore. So for example, say we just duplicated this, comment this one out, and instead of an SVG, we just want it to have like a span tag or something that said drag me. Right? Still works. So it's not coupled to like the SVG stuff anymore. So now we can make anything a sortable handle. Pretty rad. Okay, let's just kind of go back to what we had before. And we'll keep these as divs because whatever. I don't want to go through the trouble of resetting it back to list items. And let's just kind of see what we have here. So everything's kind of working, which is pretty cool. And the stuff is updating. The sort order is updating between the components. So that's pretty nice. But there's a little bit of duplication, right, in the fact that this component knows about sortable item, this component knows about sortable item. This component knows about sortable handle, this component knows about sortable handle. That's not the end of the world, but if we wanted to make these customizable, like I could see us needing an advanced option, for example, where maybe our default class collided with a class that somebody else had and they wanted to override it to something. We would want to be able to accept that as a prop and pass that down to these items, right? So why don't we just try and implement that, maybe using like props to see how it would work. Okay, so I think if I'm not mistaken, we can combine object props and array props. So if we have an object where we have the item class, and that's going to be an object with a default, if I'm not mistaken. let's check out the documentation here quickly. I don't use prop types very often, so it's always useful to double check the syntax. Props. They changed the documentation recently. Okay, static and dynamic props. Passing a Boolean. Did I skip over it? So that's the array version, prop validation. Here we go. All right. So we want to specify some default values for this. Okay, so let's say that the default item class is going to be, or say like item selector. So that's a little bit more flexible. Is sortable item, and then sortable handle for the handle selector. Let's just make sure this compiles, because I've never mixed these two types of things before. Okay, so it looks like if we're going to use object syntax, we have to go all in on object syntax. So we'll have a value, and we'll just say that this is required. So we can just do that by saying required true, and we won't specify anything else. Not too worried about the prop validation stuff. Okay, and let's just see what's going on here. Okay, so it looks like it's compiling. It looks like we have no errors. Looks like things are still working, so that's cool. So why don't we make it possible to pass this stuff in? So instead of passing this directly down like this, we're going to say this dot item selector and this dot handle selector. All right, so this should still be working, and it is. But now we have this problem, right, of this stuff is customizable in the parent, but it's still hard-coded here. So I want to talk about two solutions to this. First, let's go to app.vue and pass those in as props so we can just kind of prove that they're customizable. So why don't we say that the item selector should be, instead of a sortable item, why don't we just make it like, I don't know, like to-do item or something, right? And then handle selector, we'll make this dot to-do handle. We'll add a dot to the beginning of this one too. We don't need to bind these using the colon because they're just going to be strings. But if we go and refresh this now, I think this is going to all stop working, right? So nothing works now because we've customized this stuff, and this stuff hasn't updated to reflect that. So if we went here and we changed this to-do item and to-do handle, you know, in theory, this should work again, and it does. And you know what? I think we should revert to specifically classes, not selectors, because we can't easily add a full selector doing this sort of thing. So let's make this item class and handle class. And we'll get rid of the dot. But down here, we'll use some template literals or some template strings, sorry, to make this work. All right, and now in theory, even though this stuff is hard coded, let's just make sure our little tweak here worked. Let's get rid of this class, handle class, refresh. Oh, missed something, it looks like. Okay, so item class, to do item, handle class, to do handle, defaults. Oh, yep, good call. Item class, handle class. I wouldn't have caught that. Thank you. Okay. All right, back to working. Cool. All right, so if we wanted this to be customizable and actually have everything work, right, we need to basically somehow pass this data into the sortable item and the sortable handle. So I'll show you two ways to do it. One that I think sucks and one that I think is kind of cleaner, that uses a pretty neat Advanced Vue feature that not many people use because you probably shouldn't use it that much, but there's certain circumstances where it can be helpful, which is this one. Okay, so the first way that you might want to do this is by passing slot props up to the parent that can get passed in, right? So say here, you could do it three ways actually. Okay, so one way that you could do it is the sortable item could have a prop, which is like the item class, and you could hard code this here, right, to do item. And as long as this accepted that prop, which was like item class, and then instead of adding this here, he would just do this .item class. This should still work, and it does, right? So that's one way to do it, where we sort of hard code that class in two places. Another way to do this is to allow yourself to only put it in one spot, which is up here, and then pass it down as like a prop, right? So we could say item class is this .item class, and this could get destructured out here, and then we could add that here, and in theory this should also still work. Right, so now it's just like defined in one place, which is kind of nice. And we could do the same thing for the to-do handle. But the thing that sort of sucks about this is like you're doing all sorts of like repetition, right? And saying this in multiple places. If a sortable list is meant to be like coupled with a sortable item and sortable handle, like they're all part of this like sort of package of components, it'd be nice if there was a way to sort of have implicit behind the scenes communication between them so that you didn't have to worry about this sort of thing. And it turns out there is a cool way to do that using this feature of Vue called ProvideInject, which is similar to React's context API, which basically lets you create shared state that can be accessed by child components by a parent from a parent that's providing state to them. So I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm getting rid of all these crappy props. We'll get rid of the prop here. This is going to be broken right now, but that's okay. So now in sortable list, what we want to basically do is we want to use this provide key, and we're going to want to make it a function that returns an object. And this object is going to be stuff that the children can access if they want to access it behind the scenes without this consumer having to be concerned about it, which is kind of neat. So why don't we say that we want to pass through the item class, and that's going to come from this .item class, and we want to pass through the handle class, which is going to come from this .handle class. So what we've done here is we've made this state accessible to any children who want to be able to access it in sort of a sneaky behind the scenes way. The idea is that this is meant to be like shared context that you can have between the parent and the child. So now in this sortable item, we can add this inject property, and we can say what we're asking for. In this case, we're asking for item class, and now we can reference it here. And then the handle, we can ask for the handle class, and then we can add that here too. We don't need these props. Okay. All right, so let's find out if this is still working. Okay, so refresh, everything looks okay. Looks like stuff is working. All right, so that's kind of neat. So that's kind of like a quick introduction to how you can use this ProvideInject API to sort of create behind the scenes communication between like a group of related components that are sort of meant to be coupled together as part of like one package, which is kind of cool. So this is nice now because these classes, like the selectors that we're using, are only defined in one place. So if we want to change them, we can, and we don't have to worry about changing the child components. And now we have this thing that kind of works pretty nicely. So one thing that we need to be able to figure out how to do here is, in the original example, if you remember, it was possible for us to get rid of the handle, right? So if we look here now and I refresh this, you could drag anything, right? You don't have to just drag the handle. You could drag the whole item. In our current implementation, this isn't possible in the exact same way, because the only way to make a whole item draggable instead of the handle draggable is to basically not specify this argument, this option. You have to basically make it null. But we're always going to be passing something through, so it's always going to be expecting a handle. Well, it turns out that that's not that big of a deal in our case, because there's an easy solution to it that is maybe not completely intuitive at first. But instead of basically saying whether or not it has a handle, we can use this more declarative component-driven approach that just says, make the entire item the handle. So we can make Sortable Handle the direct child of Sortable Item, and now we're saying that the whole item is the handle. And now when we go back here and refresh this one, the whole item is draggable, and we didn't even have to change anything. So that's kind of neat. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else that would be really interesting to go through. The only thing that I think is kind of an interesting idea is maybe choosing like a different class for this sort of thing to make things like more collision resistant. But it's not that interesting of a topic. Basically, there's a cool package on NPM called CUID, I think, which is collision resistant IDs optimized for horizontal scaling. So this is the sort of thing that you can use for like HTML element IDs if you need to like generate them and stuff. It gives you a string like this. So if we wanted to, we could pull in that CUID package here, and then for every instance of the sortable list, we could use a different collision resistant ID and make that part of the class name, so that it's not going to collide with people's existing CSS class names, or be pretty unlikely to do so anyways. But that's not the end of the world, because this stuff is already customizable. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else really interesting about this. I mean, maybe it's worth just kind of like doing another quick overview of what we actually ended up with here. So here's like the original example, right, where we had like hard-coded list items using Shopify stuff from their CDN. And now we've created like an API for sorting stuff that doesn't require the consumer to know anything about this library or what its options are or how it works or anything like that. They don't have to know about any JavaScript code even, right? They don't have to know about importing any specific module or using mix-ins or using directives on their components or anything. It's all completely component driven, which is cool. So if you want to make a sortable list, you just import the sortable list component, drop in your sortable list here, and then you just fill it in, right? So here's our sortable list parent. Here's all the sortable items. Like if we wanted to make an item that wasn't sortable, say, right, like we could just copy this div, kind of stick it at the bottom here, and hard code some data into it. And now this one wouldn't be sortable, right? So we could say something like, cannot be sorted. We'll get rid of the VModel here because we don't actually have a to-do for it. Oh, did we just do something wrong? Div has no matching end tag. I missed some stuff when we were copying and pasting here. Yeah, it looks like here. Okay, so cannot be sorted. So this item, we can't sort it, but I can sort the ones around it, right? No problem, which is kind of cool. And we don't have to do anything weird with like adding different classes or anything. It's literally just using components. We just wrap it up with a component that says this is sortable. This is the handle. If we wanted to make a different piece the handle, we just wrap that with the handle, right? So say you wanted to be able to drag it by the description only. We don't have to actually do anything except move these wrappers around. So now the description is going to be the sortable handle. Do we do something screwy here? Oh, you know what it is? This needs to have a root element, right? So we can wrap this in like a span, say, because it can't just be raw text. But now like the description is what you sort it by instead of the handle. We were able to do that just by moving around some wrapper components and stuff like that. So again, these things would all be like private implementation details of these components. Nobody would ever really have to worry about these. All they have to worry about from the consumer's perspective is pulling in the components so they use them, providing the data that they want to be able to sort and synchronize, and then just kind of dropping these tags in the right place. They never have to know that we're using Shopify's stuff. They don't even have to know about the fact that it's using classes to select things, right? That's sort of like an advanced customization that someone could do if they ran into a collision. But our goal would hopefully be to namespace things in such a way that that's just really unlikely. And, from the perspective of the consumer, they just never know any of this stuff. All they have to worry about is using these components just like you would like a Vue transition component or something, right? You don't know how it works under the hood. So everything's kind of encapsulated and tucked away from you, but you can just drop in this sortable behavior sort of anywhere that you want, which is kind of neat. Something that I actually have not tried that I wanted to try on this stream is just to see like if we can easily whip up like another sortable list, say. So why don't we make another sortable list that uses the to-dos, and why don't we have a bunch of sortable items for the to-dos? But instead of using like a vertical list, let's make like a horizontal list or something. So let's do like a div as the parent here, and we'll give this like a class of like flex. And then each sortable item, we'll just make that a div that has like the to-do description in there, say. And let's make the whole sortable item a handle. So the whole thing is draggable. Man, Sublime does some funky indentation sometimes. And let's make each one of these like a fixed width. So why don't we just say, like, what do we have? Like 5 of them. Let's just make them all like 1/5 width. I don't know. We'll give them like a P8 and like a BG green and text white. I don't know. Something very ugly. And what do we got here? Draggable containers are expected to be of type node list. Did we mess something up? Let's comment out this one for a second. So now we're past teaching territory and sort of into experimentation territory. So we need the slot scope here. So let's get the items out of the slot scope. All right, and this looks horrible. So instead of width 1/5, why don't we make them like a hard-coded width like 64 and like height 64. Get rid of this. Let's still have the padding, whatever. Looks terrible. Let's make it 32. I don't know how these are all going to fit, but all right. So maybe what we want to do is put the padding inside so that we can see some space between them. And put the green on the one with the padding. Duh. What am I doing wrong here? Padding should be up here. And the background should be on this one. All right, whatever. Looks terrible. But we can sort these items still horizontally now instead of vertically. And obviously this looks horrible, but it's a completely different UI than what we had above. So it just sort of shows the flexibility of this sortable list component. You can just make, anything that you want using any interface that you want. I'm kind of curious even like what happens if this stuff has to wrap. If we add like flex wrap here. This is stuff that I haven't even played with this Shopify thing. So can I I can like move these down even in like a grid layout. I can drag things around. So kind of neat stuff, I think. We were able to build this like kind of easily reused, super customizable, unopinionated sortable list component for sorting things. Yeah, kind of neat. So I'll probably put the code for this up on GitHub. So if you just want to hack around with it, obviously this is probably not perfect and production ready, but it's a decent example of how you can do some interesting things like wrapping up a third-party library, as well as using renderless components, as well as using the ProvideInject API. So it's a bunch of different cool topics in there. So I'll throw that up on GitHub, and I'll probably tweet out the link to that, as well as put it in the description. If you thought this screencast or this live stream was interesting and you learned like a couple things, I'm actually working on a course on Vue Component Design called Advanced Vue Component Design, which you can find at just advancedvue.com, which will just redirect you here. So if you thought this stuff was interesting, you can head here and subscribe, and I'll send you some free content and free screencasts and information about like the launch discounts, and just sort of keep you updated with my progress on it. I'm hoping to release it kind of first week of May. I'll probably send out an email to that list that includes a link to this live stream with the code and stuff too. So if you want to have a reference to that, maybe that's a good reason to check it out. But anyways, go there and check that out if this was interesting to you. And hopefully I can do some more of these live streams and stuff going forward. So hopefully this was fun. Hopefully you learned a thing or two, and hopefully catch you at the next stream. Thanks, everyone.